The sky above Calastia 9 had not seen natural light in 3 generations. Smoke from 1,000,000 manufactorums churned against the crimson clouds, thick enough to taste even through rebreather filters. The hive world's upper spires pierced that perpetual gloom like broken-teeth monuments to an empire that measured progress in corpses and considered mercy a form of weakness. Natsu Dragneel fell through that poisoned air without understanding how he'd gotten there. One moment he'd been fighting flames, roaring from his fists as he faced down an enemy whose name was already slipping from memory. The next reality had torn itself apart around him. Not like a door opening or a path appearing. More like the universe had simply decided he belonged somewhere else and discarded him accordingly. He hit the ground hard enough to crack rockcrete. Pain shot through his ribs. Blood filled his mouth with the taste of copper and ash. Around him, the underhive stretched in all directions, a labyrinth of corroded metal and shadows that moved wrong. Industrial waste dripped from overhead pipes. Somewhere in the darkness, something that might have been human was screaming. Natsu pushed himself upright. His jacket hung in tatters. Burns covered his arms, though he couldn't remember getting them. The air stank of promethium, and something worse, something that made his stomach clench with an instinct older than thought. The screaming stopped abruptly. He moved toward where the sound had been, one hand pressed against his ribs. The underhive's floor was uneven, centuries of industrial refuse compressed into layers that shifted underfoot. Cables thick as tree trunks snaked across walls covered in rust and something that looked like dried blood. Lumens flickered overhead, casting shadows that jerked and danced. 3 figures stood in what had once been a cargo bay. 2 adults, a man and a woman, knelt with their hands bound behind them. 2 children huddled against the woman's side. All 4 wore the gray rags that seemed to be standard clothing in this place. Their faces were hollow with hunger and something deeper than fear. The 3 standing figures wore robes, dyed dark with stains that were definitely blood. Crude symbols had been carved into the fabric designs that hurt to look at directly. One held a rusted knife. Another gripped a flamer, its pilot light casting orange shadows across a face that had forgotten what sanity looked like. The third was chanting. The words made no sense, but they felt wrong in a way that transcended language. Each syllable seemed to press against the world, trying to force reality into shapes it was never meant to hold. The man with the flamer grinned. His teeth had been filed to points. For the blood god, he said. The chanting stopped. All 3 cultists turned toward Natsu with synchronized precision that spoke of something other than human coordination. The one who'd been speaking tilted his head, studying Natsu like a butcher evaluating meat. Another offering, the cultist said. The gods provide. Natsu's fist caught fire. He didn't think about it. Didn't plan or calculate or consider consequences. His body simply responded to what it saw: people who needed help, and monsters wearing human skin who needed to stop breathing. The cultist with the flamer jerked the weapon toward him. Promethium ignited in a roaring stream. Natsu walked through it. The flames licked at his burned skin, but they felt distant, irrelevant. His own fire burned hotter, fed by something deeper than fuel and oxygen. His punch caught the cultist in the center of his chest. Bone shattered. The impact lifted the man off his feet and slammed him into the wall hard enough to leave a crater in the corroded metal. The flamer clattered to the ground, still spewing fire across the rockcrete. The other 2 cultists moved. Faster than their emaciated bodies should have allowed. The one with the knife-lunged blade aimed for Natsu's throat. The chanting one raised his hands, and the air around him began to shimmer with colors that didn't belong in normal space. Natsu pivoted, letting the knife slide past his neck close enough to feel the blade's chill. His elbow drove into the cultist's jaw. Teeth and blood sprayed across the floor. The man stumbled backward, and Natsu's follow-up kick sent him crashing into a pile of rusted machinery. The chanting cultist's hands erupted with purple light. Something formed in the air between them, a shape that hurt to perceive. It had too many angles, too many surfaces that shouldn't fit together, but somehow did. The shape lunged forward with a sound like glass breaking in reverse. Natsu met it with a straight punch wreathed in flame. His fire and the impossible shape collided in an explosion that knocked everyone in the cargo bay to the ground. When the light cleared, the chanting cultist lay sprawled on his back, smoke rising from his chest. The purple light was gone. Whatever he'd been summoning had vanished, without leaving any trace. It had existed. Silence settled over the cargo bay, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and ragged breathing. The family of four stared at Natsu with expressions that mixed terror and something that might have been hope. The father's lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Natsu extinguished his flames and stumbled toward them. His ribs screamed protest with each step. Blood still leaked from his mouth. But the family needed their bonds cut, and he didn't see anyone else volunteering for the job. He knelt beside the father, studying the rope binding his wrists. Industrial cable wound tight enough to cut off circulation. Natsu heated one finger until it glowed and pressed it against the binding. The synthetic material melted and parted. The father jerked his hands free, rubbing circulation back into his wrists. His eyes never left Natsu's face. "What are you?" he whispered. Natsu didn't have an answer. He moved to the mother's bonds, repeating the process. The children watched him with eyes too old for their gaunt faces. When the last cable parted, the mother pulled her children close and began checking them for injuries with hands that shook. "You need to get out of here," Natsu said. His voice came out rougher than intended, thick with exhaustion. "Find somewhere safe." The father's laugh held no humor. "Safe in the underhive." "You're not from around here, are you?" "No." Natsu straightened, swaying slightly. The cargo bay spun. "But I'm guessing those three weren't the only ones like them." "Chaos cults are everywhere," the mother said quietly, still holding her children. "They've been growing stronger for months. The Arbites don't come down this far anymore. The priests say it's the Emperor's punishment for our sins." The word meant nothing to Natsu. Emperor, Arbites, chaos. He'd landed in a place where even the language carried implications he didn't understand. But understanding could wait. Right now, people were dying, and apparently nobody was doing anything about it. "Show me where they gather," he said. The father shook his head. "You don't understand. There are hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They control entire sectors. You can't fight them all." Natsu wiped blood from his mouth. His hand came away red and shaking. The father was probably right. He was injured, exhausted, and completely lost in a world that made no sense. The smart move would be to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to recover, somewhere to figure out what the hell had happened to him. But he'd never been particularly smart. "Just point me in the right direction," he said. The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her ragged clothing and pulled out a scrap of cloth with crude symbols drawn in what looked like charcoal. "Sector 719, she said, 3 levels down. They meet there for their rituals. But please, if you're going to fight them, wait. Get help. Contact the ecclesiarchy or the guard or anyone who might actually have a chance." Natsu took the cloth. The symbols meant nothing to him, but he memorized them anyway. "How many people live down here?" "In the underhive?" The father's voice was hollow. "Millions. Most of us born here die here. The upper levels don't care what happens as long as quotas get met and tithes get paid. Then I guess nobody's coming to help." He turned toward the cargo bay's exit. His body protested every movement, but he ignored it. Pain was temporary. People dying because nobody bothered to help them was permanent. "Wait." The woman's voice stopped him. "What's your name so we can pray for you? If you have a patron saint, maybe they'll intercede." Natsu looked back at the family. They huddled together in the flickering light, surrounded by corpses and the wreckage of whatever life they'd been trying to build in this nightmare. The children's faces were gaunt with hunger. The parents' eyes reflected a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. "Natsu," he said. "Natsu Dragneel. And I don't know about saints, but I don't plan on dying today." He left before they could respond, following the cargo bay's exit into a tunnel that descended deeper into the underhive's maze. Behind him, he heard the father whisper something to his wife. The words were too quiet to make out, but the tone carried clearly enough. Gratitude and pity. As if Natsu were already dead, and the only question was how many others would die with him. The tunnel sloped downward at an angle that made walking difficult. Water dripped from overhead pipes, leaving trails of rust and chemical residue. Every few meters, another tunnel branched off, leading to destinations marked by symbols Natsu couldn't read. The deeper he went, the worse the smell became, layers of industrial waste and human suffering compressed into an atmosphere that felt almost solid. Voices drifted up from below, chanting similar to what he'd heard in the cargo bay, but larger, multiple throats speaking in twisted unison. The sound raised goosebumps on his arms. Natsu descended toward the voices. His flames flickered to life around his fists, casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. Whatever he was about to walk into, fire seemed like the appropriate response. The tunnel opened into a chamber that had once been part of the hive's infrastructure. Pipes the size of buildings ran along the walls, their surfaces covered in the same rust and blood mixture he'd seen everywhere else. Crude altars had been constructed from scrap metal and bones. And between those altars, packed shoulder to shoulder, stood what looked like hundreds of cultists. They all turned toward the tunnel entrance when Natsu emerged. For a moment, nobody moved. The cultists stared at him with eyes that reflected nothing human. Natsu stared back, flames casting orange light across their scarred faces and tattered robes. Then someone screamed, not in fear, but in what sounded like joy. The word they shrieked meant nothing to Natsu, but the intent was clear enough. The entire crowd surged forward like a wave of rotting flesh and rusted metal. Natsu met them with fire. His right hand blazed bright enough to hurt. The punch caught the first cultist in the face, and the man's head simply vanished in a burst of flame and steam. Natsu spun his elbow, driving into another cultist's ribs hard enough to crack bone and set clothing ablaze. A knife scraped across his shoulder, drawing blood. He grabbed the wielder's wrist and squeezed until bones cracked, then used the man as a club to batter aside 3 more attackers. They came at him from all sides, a press of bodies that made proper fighting impossible. Natsu abandoned technique and settled for brutality. Each punch left another cultist burning. Each kick sent bodies flying backward into their comrades. Blood slicked the floor, the air filled with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. Something grabbed his ankle. He looked down to see a cultist on the ground, her face a mass of scar tissue and ritual brands. Her mouth was open, impossibly wide, and inside that mouth, Natsu glimpsed colors that shouldn't exist and shapes that made his eyes water. He brought his other foot down on her head. The impact shattered her skull. But those impossible colors lingered for a moment before fading like smoke. More cultists poured in from side passages. They didn't fight like trained warriors. There was no coordination, no strategy. Just a tide of bodies wielding crude weapons and teeth filed to points. They threw themselves at him with the same enthusiasm they might have brought to a religious festival, which Natsu realized was probably exactly what this was to them. He grabbed one of the bone altars and swung it like a bat. Cultists went flying. The altar shattered against a support pillar, and Natsu used the largest remaining piece as a club. Fire coursed along its length, setting everything it touched ablaze. The chamber filled with smoke. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Natsu fought by feel and instinct, his flames providing the only light. Bodies piled around him. The floor grew slick with blood and other fluids he didn't want to identify. Then abruptly the press of bodies fell away. Natsu stood in a rough circle of corpses and dying fires, breathing hard. His ribs throbbed. New cuts covered his arms and chest. But he was standing and the cultists were backing away, not retreating. Clearing space, making room for something. The smoke swirled and parted. Through it came a figure that made the other cultists look sane and healthy by comparison. It stood twice the height of a normal person, its proportions all wrong, limbs too long and jointed in too many places. Its skin was the color of old blood. Its face was all teeth and eyes, too many of each arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The thing that shouldn't exist opened its mouth and spoke in a voice like breaking glass. "The gods hunger," it said, "and you burn so brightly." Natsu's flames flared higher, hot enough that the nearest corpses began to smolder. "Yeah," he said. "Good. I'm still hungry too." The demon charged. Natsu met it halfway. They collided in an explosion of fire and impossible geometry. Claws raked across Natsu's chest, cutting through fabric and flesh like they were the same thing. He caught one of those two long arms and pulled flames coursing along its length. The demon shrieked a sound that made the tunnel walls crack. They grappled, trading blows that would have killed normal men. The daemon was strong, far stronger than its twisted frame suggested. But Natsu had spent his entire life fighting things that were stronger, faster, or more dangerous than him. Strength meant nothing if you didn't know how to use it. He ducked under a wild swing and drove his fist into the demon's midsection. His flames erupted inside the thing's body. It screamed again, this time with pain rather than rage. Natsu pressed the advantage landing combinations that would have reduced steel to slag. The demon's form began to waver, its edges becoming indistinct. The impossible colors that made up its flesh started to fade. It lashed out one more time, claws catching Natsu across the face and spinning him around. Blood poured from the new wounds. Natsu's vision blurred. But he stayed on his feet, turning back toward the demon with flames building around both fists. The demon was already dissolving. Its body came apart like smoke in wind, pieces of it drifting away into nothing. The cultists who'd been watching the fight backed away further, their expressions mixing terror with something that looked like religious awe. When the last trace of the demon vanished, Natsu was left standing alone in a chamber full of corpses and dying fires. The cultists stared at him from the passages and shadows. Nobody moved. "Anyone else?" Natsu asked. His voice echoed in the sudden silence. Blood dripped from his wounds to pool on the floor. The flames around his hands flickered and died. Exhaustion finally catching up with him. The cultists broke and ran. All of them simultaneously, as if they'd received a signal Natsu couldn't perceive. They poured into the side passages and disappeared into the underhive's maze, leaving him alone with the dead. Natsu swayed, then sat down hard on the edge of one of the broken altars. His ribs weren't just bruised anymore. At least two felt cracked. The cuts across his face and chest were deep enough to need serious attention. And he was so tired that even keeping his eyes open felt like a monumental effort. But he was alive. The family he'd saved was alive. And somewhere in this nightmare hive, there were probably other people who needed help. He'd rest, just for a minute. Then he'd figure out what to do next. The underhive's darkness closed around him, thick and patient. In that darkness, countless eyes watched the pink-haired stranger who'd killed a demon with his bare hands. Some of those eyes belonged to desperate people clinging to hope. Others belonged to things that had never been human, calculating the threat this newcomer represented. And high above in the hive's upper levels, where clean air and natural light were privileges reserved for those who could afford them, instruments detected an anomaly. Energy readings that matched no known Imperial weapon. Warp disturbances too small to be a major incursion, but too persistent to ignore. Reports were filed. Authorities were notified. And somewhere in the depths of a ship in high orbit, an Inquisitor received word of something impossible occurring in the underhive of Calastian 9. The machinery of the Imperium began to turn slow and inexorable as always. By the time it reached a conclusion about what to do with Natsu Dragneel, the boy would have already changed everything. In this universe, after all, saving even a single person was an anomaly worth investigating, and Natsu planned to save many more than one. Natsu woke to voices arguing in the darkness. His ribs ached. The cuts across his face and chest had scabbed over, pulling tight whenever he moved. He'd collapsed in that ritual chamber and somehow managed to drag himself into a side passage before unconsciousness claimed him. How long he'd been out, he couldn't say. Time moved strangely in the underhive, where perpetual darkness made hours and days indistinguishable. The voices belonged to people gathered nearby. Natsu could smell cooking meat, the first pleasant scent he'd encountered since arriving in this nightmare. His stomach clenched with hunger, sharp enough to cut. He pushed himself upright, biting back a groan. Every muscle protested. The burns on his arms had started to heal, but they still stung when he flexed his fingers. At least nothing seemed broken, just bruised cut and thoroughly beaten up. The voices grew louder as he approached their source. A makeshift camp had been established in what looked like an abandoned cargo junction. Scrap metal had been arranged into crude shelters. A fire burned in a rusted barrel fed by what Natsu hoped was just wood. 20 or 30 people huddled around the light, their faces hollow with malnutrition and exhaustion. The family he'd saved sat near the fire. The father looked up when Natsu emerged from the shadows, and something that might have been relief crossed his gaunt features. "You're alive," the man said. The conversation around the fire stopped. Everyone turned to stare at Natsu with expressions he couldn't quite read. "Yeah." Natsu moved closer to the warmth. "How long was I out?" 2 days. We thought you died." The mother held her children close, but she didn't look afraid anymore. "We brought you here after you collapsed. It seems safer than leaving you in that chamber." 2 days. Natsu's stomach growled loud enough for everyone to hear. Several people flinched at the sound. "Here." The father handed him a bowl containing something that looked like gray paste mixed with chunks of unidentifiable meat. "It's not much, but it's all we have." Natsu didn't waste time asking questions. He ate, and the taste was somehow worse than the smell. But it was food, and his body needed it. He finished the bowl in seconds and tried not to think about what he might have just consumed. "You killed them," someone said from across the fire. A young woman barely out of her teens with burn scars covering half her face. "The cultists, all of them, we saw." Natsu wiped his mouth. "They were hurting people." "They control 5 sectors, an old man said. His voice rasped like metal grinding on stone. "Thousands of them. You killed maybe 100, destroyed 1 ritual site. There are dozens more. Then I'll destroy those too." The words hung in the air. Several people exchanged glances that Natsu couldn't interpret. The father cleared his throat. "You don't understand what you're offering. The cults have been growing for months. The Arbites won't come down here. The ecclesiarchy says we deserve it for our sins. The upper hive doesn't care as long as manufacturing quotas get met." He gestured at the huddled masses around the fire. "We're nothing to them. Less than nothing." "That's not right." The old man laughed, bitter and hollow. "Right. Wrong. Those are luxuries for people who live in the upper spires. Down here we just try to survive another day." Natsu stood, ignoring how his ribs protested the movement. "Where are the other ritual sites?" Silence greeted his question. Then the father pulled out a scrap of fabric and began marking it with ash from the fire. His hand shook as he drew crude maps and symbols. "Sector 722, 3 levels down. That's where they sacrifice to the blood god. Sector 715, same level, they have altars to something they call the Plague Father." He kept drawing, marking location after location. There are more. Always more. They're like a disease spreading through the underhive. The woman with the scarred face spoke again. Why are you doing this? You're not from here. You could leave. Find your way to the upper levels, maybe get off-world. Natsu took the map from the father's trembling hands. Because nobody else is. He turned to leave. The mother called after him. Wait. You need to rest. You're still injured. If you go now, they'll kill you. Probably. Natsu studied the crude map, memorizing the locations. But people are dying while I'm sitting here eating your food. So I'm going now. The father stood, desperation creasing his features. You can't save everyone. Even if you destroy every ritual site, even if you kill every cultist, there will be more. There's always more. This is the underhive. This is how things are. Natsu met his eyes. Then I'll change how things are. He left before anyone could argue further. Behind him, he heard whispers starting. The words made no sense, but the tone carried clearly. Fear mixed with something that sounded dangerously like hope. The map led him deeper into the underhive's labyrinth. Natsu followed the markings the father had drawn, descending through passages that grew progressively worse. Rust gave way to corrosion. Chemical runoff pooled on the floor, burning through his boots. The smell of decay became so thick he could taste it. He found the first ritual site in what had been a water reclamation facility. The cultists had converted the filtration tanks into altars, filling them with blood and offal. Symbols had been carved into every surface, crude and chaotic, but arranged in patterns that suggested terrible purpose. 30 cultists tended the altars, chanting words that made Natsu's teeth ache. None of them noticed him until his first punch shattered someone's spine. Then they all noticed. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. Natsu was faster, stronger, and significantly more motivated. His flames reduced the ritual circles to slag. His fists turned cultists into corpses. By the time the last one fell, the entire chamber was ablaze. Cleansing flame consuming decades of accumulated corruption. The second site required more effort. 80 cultists, better organized, led by someone who could shape purple light into weapons that cut like knives. Natsu took wounds that would have killed normal men, then kept fighting anyway. His flames eventually consumed the purple light and the person wielding it. The third site featured a demon, small, barely corporeal, but fast enough to claw open Natsu's shoulder before he caught it by what passed for its throat and crushed it until it stopped existing. The fourth site had barricades and prepared positions. The cultists had been warned, had set traps and ambushes. Natsu walked through all of it with flames blazing hot enough to melt metal. By the time he reached the fifth site, word had spread. The cultists ran before he even arrived, abandoning their altars and disappearing into the underhive's depths. Natsu destroyed the empty ritual circles and moved on. Days blurred together. He ate when refugees offered food. He slept in abandoned passages when his body refused to go further. He fought cultists and demons and things that existed somewhere between the two. His flames became a constant companion, burning away the darkness and everything hiding in it. And everywhere he went, people watched. They huddled in the shadows of collapsed structures. They peered from makeshift shelters built in the ruins of forgotten industry. They saw him coming wreathed in fire that didn't consume him. And they began to believe in something they'd forgotten how to name. Hope, perhaps, or salvation, or simply the possibility that someone might actually give a damn about whether they lived or died. Natsu didn't notice at first. He was too busy fighting to pay attention to the crowds gathering in his wake. But gradually, it became impossible to ignore. People followed him. Not close enough to be in danger, but near enough to watch what happened when he encountered cultists or demons. They cheered when he won. They prayed when he fell. And when he stood back up, bleeding and exhausted, but still alive, they whispered words in a language he didn't understand. It took 3 weeks before someone translated for him. "Fire angel," the scarred woman said. She'd been following him for days, along with a growing crowd of refugees. They're calling you the Fire Angel. They think you were sent by the Emperor. Natsu sat in a junction cleared of cultist presence, eating something that allegedly used to be food. His body was a map of scars, new and old. Burns covered burns. Cuts overlapped cuts. He'd stopped bothering to rest properly because every time he did, he could hear screaming from somewhere else in the underhive. "I'm not an angel," he said. "I know, but they don't care what you are. They care what you do." The woman gestured at the crowd, keeping respectful distance. "You fight the cultists. You destroy the altars. You make the demons go away. That's more than anyone else has done for them in their entire lives. Someone should have been doing it already." Yes, someone should have. She sat down beside him, her scarred face reflecting firelight. But nobody did. The Arbites don't come down here. The guard doesn't care. The ecclesiarchy writes us off as lost souls. You're the only one who's actually fighting. Natsu finished his meal and stood. His ribs still ached, but they'd healed enough that breathing didn't hurt anymore. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." "No," the woman said quietly. "You're doing what you think anyone would do. But we've lived down here our whole lives. We know better." The crowd followed him to the next ritual site, and the next, and the one after that. By the end of the 4th week, Natsu had destroyed 43 ritual circles, killed thousands of cultists, and banished dozens of demons back to whatever hell had spawned them. The Underhive's character began to change. Sectors that had been controlled by cults for years suddenly found themselves free. Refugees emerged from hiding to reclaim abandoned territory. People who'd learned to live as prey started remembering how to be human. And they all looked to Natsu when they needed protection. He didn't want it. The attention, the expectations, the way people knelt when he passed. It reminded him too much of responsibility he wasn't qualified for. He wasn't a leader or a savior or an angel. He was just someone who couldn't walk away from people who needed help. But the Underhive didn't care what he wanted. It needed something to believe in, and Natsu had become that something whether he liked it or not. The transformation wasn't universal. Large sections of the Underhive remained firmly under cultist control. Demons still prowled the deepest levels. But for the first time in generations, there were areas where normal people could live without constant fear of ritual sacrifice or demonic predation. It couldn't last. Natsu knew that even if the refugees didn't, he was one person, fighting an enemy that seemed to have infinite replacements. Every cultist he killed, 10 more appeared. Every demon he banished, another manifested somewhere else. He was winning individual battles while steadily losing the war. Exhaustion became his constant companion. Not just physical tiredness, though that was bad enough. Something deeper, a weariness that settled into his bones and made every movement feel like wading through concrete. His flames still burned when he needed them, but they required more effort to summon. Burned less brightly left him drained afterward. He was running out of strength. And he was starting to understand that strength alone wouldn't be enough to fix this place. The realization hit him one night, while he sat in another refugee camp surrounded by people who looked at him like he was their only hope. They didn't see the exhaustion or the doubt. They saw someone who fought and won, who drove back the darkness and made spaces where they could breathe. They didn't understand that he was fighting a tide with his bare hands. "You should rest," the father from the first family said. He'd become something like Natsu's unofficial liaison with the refugee population. "You've been fighting for weeks without stopping. Even angels need rest." "I'm not an angel. Tell them that." The father gestured at the crowd. Hundreds now gathered in sectors Natsu had cleared of cultist presence. They've already built shrines. Did you know that they pray to you? Light candles in your honor. They think you're a saint, sent by the Emperor. Natsu's stomach twisted. I'm not. I'm just someone who couldn't stand watching people get hurt. Then you're better than any saint we've had. The father sat down, his face illuminated by firelight. But you're also killing yourself. We can see it. Every fight leaves you weaker. Every demon you banish takes something out of you. You can't sustain this. What else am I supposed to do? The question hung between them. The father had no answer, because there wasn't one. The Underhive's problems were too deep, too systemic. They required solutions Natsu didn't have, and resources he couldn't access. All he could do was fight and hope that somehow, somewhere, it would be enough. But he was starting to suspect it wouldn't be. High above the Underhive, in levels where clean air and natural light were taken for granted, other conversations were occurring. The ecclesiarchy took note of spontaneous worship developing in the lower levels. Reports filtered up through the hierarchy, each one describing the same phenomenon: refugees, organizing around a figure they called the Fire Angel building shrines, conducting unsanctioned prayers. The Ordo Malleus received alerts about warp disturbances in the Underhive. Energy readings that didn't match standard demon manifestations. Ritual circles being destroyed without Imperial intervention. Something was disrupting chaos operations on Calastian 9, and nobody could explain what or why. Inquisitors began asking questions. Tech priests analyzed energy signatures. Administratum officials cross-referenced reports with archived data, searching for precedents or explanations. And slowly, inexorably, the machinery of the Imperium focused its attention on the Underhive of Calastian 9. Natsu knew none of this. He was too busy fighting to notice the sensors tracking his movements or the instruments measuring his flames. He didn't see the ships moving into higher orbits or the kill teams being assembled in distant monasteries. He just kept fighting because people needed help and nobody else was offering it. The woman with the scarred face found him after he'd cleared another ritual site. This one had been particularly vicious, featuring 3 daemons and over 100 cultists. Natsu had won, but the victory had left him with new wounds and depleted reserves. "They're coming," she said without preamble. Natsu looked up from binding a gash on his forearm. "Who?" "The Imperium. The real Imperium, not just the Arbites or the Guard. I have contacts in the Middle Hive. They're saying Inquisitors are asking about you. Space Marines have been deployed." Her scarred face was grim. "They think you're a threat." "I'm helping people. That's what makes you a threat." She crouched beside him, her voice low and urgent. "You're giving people hope without Imperial sanction. You're operating without oversight or control. You're disrupting established power structures. Even if you're doing good, the Imperium can't allow that." Natsu finished binding his arm. "So what do they want me to do? Stop fighting. Let the cultists keep sacrificing people. I don't know what they want. But I know what usually happens when the Imperium decides something is a threat." Her eyes reflected firelight and something that looked like fear. "They erase it." In the distance, something that sounded like thunder rumbled through the Underhive's metal veins. But there was no storm in this place. No weather at all beneath the hive's oppressive structure. It was the sound of ceramite boots on metal decking, the distinctive rhythm of Space Marines advancing with purpose. They were coming for him. And Natsu, surrounded by refugees who believed he was their salvation, had no idea what he was going to do about it. The Space Marines arrived at dawn, though dawn in the Underhive meant only that the lumens cycled to a slightly brighter setting. Natsu was sleeping when the ceramite boots started their rhythmic thunder through the metal passages. He woke instantly, every sense screaming danger in a language older than thought. The refugees around him stirred confusion, giving way to terror as the sound grew closer. "What is that?" someone whispered. The scarred woman, who'd been following Natsu for weeks, met his eyes. Her expression held no surprise, only grim acceptance. The Imperium's answer. Natsu stood ignoring the protest of muscles that hadn't fully recovered from the previous day's fighting. He'd destroyed 2 more ritual sites yesterday, banished a demon that had taken form in a collapsed manufactorum, saved 30 people trapped in a structure the cultists had been using for sacrifices. Standard work by his current measure. Apparently, someone had decided that work needed to stop. The refugees began backing away from the passage entrance. Parents pulled children close. The old and injured struggled to their feet, driven by instinct to put distance between themselves and whatever was coming. Natsu understood. He'd heard the fear in their voices when they talked about the upper hive, about the forces that supposedly protected humanity, but never descended far enough to protect people like them. 5 figures emerged from the passage. They had to duck to fit through openings designed for normal humans. Their armor was midnight blue, scarred from countless battles, but maintained with religious devotion. Each one carried weapons that looked like they could reduce a building to rubble. Their helmets were blank death masks that betrayed no humanity behind them. Space Marines. Natsu had heard refugees whisper about them with the same reverence they used for saints and the Emperor himself. Humanity's finest warriors, gene-crafted demigods who knew no fear and served with absolute loyalty. Right now, they looked like they'd come to execute someone. The lead Marine's helmet turned tracking across the refugees, huddled in their makeshift camp. His voice, when he spoke, came from external speakers, with a quality that suggested the man behind the armor had long ago forgotten what normal conversation sounded like. You are in violation of Imperial decree. Unauthorized gathering, unsanctioned worship, distribution of heretical materials. Each word fell like a hammer blow. This sector is hereby declared in contempt of proper authority. Natsu stepped forward, putting himself between the Marines and the refugees. They're not doing anything wrong. They're just trying to survive. The lead Marine's helmet locked onto him. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the Marine raised one gauntleted hand, pointing at Natsu with the casual authority of someone who'd never been disobeyed. You are the anomaly. Unregistered psyker activity. Warp-tainted flame. 43 ritual sites destroyed without Imperial sanction. The Marine's tone didn't change, but something about his posture suggested disapproval deeper than simple violation of protocol. You have disrupted established order. You have gathered civilians without authority. You have become an object of unsanctioned faith. I'm helping people. You are creating instability. The other 4 Marines spread out a practiced movement that spoke of centuries fighting together. They didn't aim their weapons yet, but the threat was clear. Natsu could feel their attention focused on him, like targeting lasers, measuring angles and distances, calculating how quickly they could eliminate him if the situation required it. Instability. Natsu's fists clenched. These people were being sacrificed by chaos cults. Where were you when that was happening? The Arbites had classified lower sectors as acceptable losses, the lead Marine said. His tone suggested he was stating simple fact rather than defending a decision. Manufacturing quotas were being met. Strategic priorities required forces elsewhere. The chaos presence was within tolerable parameters. Tolerable. Natsu's flames flickered to life around his hands. He didn't consciously summon them. They simply responded to the rage building in his chest. They were killing children. They were tearing people apart for rituals. And you're telling me that was tolerable? The scarred woman grabbed his arm. Don't. Please. They'll kill all of us. One of the other Marines spoke, his voice identical to the first, despite coming from a different person. The woman speaks truth. Continued resistance will result in pacification protocols. Civilian casualties are acceptable if order is maintained. Natsu looked at the refugees. Men and women who'd survived in conditions that would have broken most people. Children who'd learned to fear the dark because monsters really did live in it. They'd started to hope these past weeks. They'd begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone actually cared whether they lived or died. Now, they were learning the truth. The Imperium didn't care. Not about them, not about justice. Only about maintaining a system so broken that mass sacrifice was acceptable as long as the right forms got filed and the proper quotas got met. No, Natsu said quietly. The lead Marine tilted his head slightly. Clarify your statement. I said no. You're not hurting these people. You're not executing them because they dared to hope for something better. If that's what your Imperium requires, then your Imperium is wrong. The temperature in the chamber dropped. The Marines went utterly still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. When the lead Marine spoke again, his voice carried weight that suggested he was pronouncing judgment on more than just a conversation. You have declared yourself in opposition to the Emperor's will. This constitutes heresy. The penalty is death. His bolt pistol came up. The muzzle looked like a tunnel leading to oblivion. Behind him, the other 4 Marines raised their weapons barrels, targeting Natsu's center mass with precision that suggested they'd never missed a shot in their entire existence. Final warning, the lead Marine said. Submit to Imperial judgment or be destroyed. Natsu's flames blazed brighter. You want me, come get me, but you leave them alone. The Marines opened fire. Natsu moved. The bolter rounds were faster than normal bullets, but he'd spent his entire life fighting things that were faster. He twisted between the first volley flames trailing from his hands as he closed the distance. One Marine's shots clipped his shoulder, the mass-reactive rounds detonating against his burned jacket. Pain exploded through his arm, but he kept moving, kept closing, his fist connected with the lead Marine's chest plate. The impact drove the massive warrior backward, ceramite cracking under force that shouldn't have existed in a normal human frame. The Marine staggered, but didn't fall, already bringing his bolt pistol around for another shot. Natsu ducked under the weapon and drove his knee into the Marine's midsection. The armor held, but the force still transferred, lifting the Marine off his feet. Before he could follow up, 2 more Marines slammed into him from the sides, their combined mass crushing him against the rockcrete floor. He erupted in flames. The Marines jerked back, armor smoking where his fire had scorched the paint. Natsu rolled to his feet, breathing hard. His shoulder throbbed where the bolter rounds had detonated. New burns covered his arms. But he was still standing, and the Marines looked less invincible than they had 30 seconds ago. Stand down, the lead Marine commanded. Not to Natsu, but to the refugees who'd been edging toward the exits. Remain in place or be considered hostile. One of the other Marines shifted his weapon toward the crowd. The message was clear. Resist and everyone dies. No. Natsu's shout carried more than just volume. It carried fury and desperation and something that might have been betrayal. Your fight is with me. Leave them alone. They are contaminated by your presence, the Marine said. Unsanctioned faith must be purged before it spreads. This is mercy. Quick death rather than slow corruption. The bolt gun swung toward a mother holding 2 children. Her face went white. The children didn't understand enough to be afraid. They just clutched their mother's ragged clothes and stared at the massive armored figure with wide, confused eyes. Natsu's body moved before his mind finished processing what was happening. He crossed the distance between himself and the Marine in a burst of speed that left his boots smoking on the rockcrete. His hand caught the bolt gun barrel as it fired, redirecting the shot into the ceiling. Rubble rained down as the mass-reactive round detonated overhead. I said no. The Marine's response was immediate and brutal. His other hand came around in a backhand that would have decapitated a normal human. Natsu took it on his raised forearm bone, jarring against ceramite. Then he grabbed the Marine's wrist and pulled, using the warrior's own momentum to send him crashing into 2 of his brothers. The lead Marine was already moving, closing the distance with textbook precision, his power fist activated with a crackle of energy fields. The weapon could punch through tank armor. It would reduce Natsu to paste. Natsu met him head-on. His flame-wreathed fist collided with the power fist in an explosion of fire and electricity that sent shock waves through the chamber. Both of them staggered. The Marine's power fist sparked and died overloaded circuits, unable to handle the heat. Natsu's hand felt like he'd punched a mountain, but it still worked. "You cannot win," the Marine said. His voice held no anger or frustration, just statement of fact. "Your flames burn hot, but we are trained to endure. You are exhausted. We are not. Mathematics are against you." He was right. Natsu could feel his reserves depleting. Weeks of constant fighting had left him running on fumes and stubbornness. These warriors were fresh equipped with the best weapons the Imperium could provide, and they had absolutely no compunction about killing everyone in this chamber if they decided it was necessary. Mathematics were against him, but mathematics had never stopped him before. "Then let's change the math," Natsu said, and threw himself at all 5 Marines simultaneously. What followed wasn't a fight so much as controlled chaos. Natsu's flames blazed hot enough to warp the rockcrete beneath his feet. He moved between the Marines with desperate speed, hitting and moving, never staying still long enough for their superior firepower to matter. His fists left dents in ceramite. His flames melted through armor joints, targeting weak points with precision born from weeks of combat. The Marines adapted. They stopped trying to shoot him and switched to close combat using their superior mass and training to corner him. Their blows were methodical, each one designed to herd him toward positions where multiple warriors could strike simultaneously. Natsu took hits that should have killed him. A bolt pistol round detonated against his ribs, cracking bone. A power sword's edge caught his leg, cutting through muscle. A combat knife punched into his shoulder, seeking the joint. Each wound added to the tally, each injury slowing him incrementally. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because behind him, the refugees watched with expressions that mixed hope and terror. They'd started to believe that someone might actually protect them. If he went down now, that belief died with him. So he kept fighting. His flames consumed the lead Marine's helmet, melting through ceramite until the warrior was forced to discard it. The face beneath was pale scarred, with eyes that held centuries of warfare. It was the first human expression Natsu had seen from any of them, and it revealed nothing but cold determination. "You fight well," the Marine acknowledged, his voice no longer filtered through speakers. "But this changes nothing. You are a threat to Imperial order. You will be neutralized." "I'm a threat." Natsu's laugh came out as a pained wheeze. "Your order lets children get sacrificed. Your system protects monsters and punishes victims. And you call me the threat." "Yes." The Marine's answer was immediate and absolute. "Because you offer hope that the system can change. Hope leads to question. Questions lead to doubt. Doubt leads to chaos. Better a cruel order than kind anarchy." He lunged forward, using his superior weight to drive Natsu backward. The other Marines closed in, forming a living wall of ceramite and murder. Natsu's flames flickered exhaustion, finally catching up with him. Then he heard it. A voice from the crowd, thin and wavering, but growing stronger. "Fire Angel?" Others took up the chant. "Fire Angel, Fire Angel." The Marines faltered. Not from the words themselves, but from what they represented. Unsanctioned worship. Spontaneous faith directed at something other than the Emperor. The kind of thing that got planets declared heretic and subjected to exterminatus. "Cease your chanting," the lead Marine commanded. "You compound your heresy." The refugees didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Men and women who'd spent their lives keeping their heads down, accepting suffering as the natural state of existence, were choosing defiance. Not because they thought it would save them, because they'd finally found something worth dying for. Hope. The lead Marine's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he'd reached a decision. "Brother Sergeant Thalric," he said into his vox, "recommend escalation to cleansing protocols. The contamination is more severe than initial assessments indicated. Acknowledged, Brother Captain Routh, a voice crackled back. Prepare for withdrawal. Cleansing team will arrive within the hour. Routh looked at Natsu, then at the still chanting refugees. This is your doing. These deaths will be on your conscience. No. Natsu straightened, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion. These deaths will be on yours. You're the ones who decided that hope was more dangerous than cultists. You're the ones who would rather kill people than admit your system is broken. The system functions. It has kept humanity alive for 10,000 years. Your feelings are irrelevant against that reality. Then maybe 10,000 years is long enough. Routh's expression finally shifted. Not to anger or shock, but to something that might have been pity. You truly don't understand what you're saying. The Imperium is all that stands between humanity and extinction. Without it, chaos would consume every world. Without it, trillions would die screaming. And with it, they die anyway, just more quietly. The Space Marines began their withdrawal movements precise, despite their damaged armor. They kept their weapons trained on Natsu until they reached the passage entrance. Brother Captain Routh paused at the threshold. For what it's worth, he said, you fought with honor. In another time, another place, you would have made a fine battle brother. He replaced his ruined helmet with a spare from his belt. But honor means nothing when set against necessity. The cleaners will come. They will purge this sector. And I will file a report recommending that the Fire Angel be classified as a threat requiring inquisitorial attention. He turned and departed, his brothers following in disciplined formation. The sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than sound. The refugees stopped chanting. The reality of what had just happened settled over them like a shroud. They defied the Imperium. They had chosen sides, and now they would pay the price. You need to run, Natsu said. His voice came out rough, damaged from the fighting. Get as far from here as you can. Find somewhere they won't look. The scarred woman shook her head. There is nowhere they won't look. Not if they've decided to cleanse us. Then I'll buy you time. How you can barely stand. She was right. Natsu's legs shook with exhaustion. The wounds covering his body leaked blood onto the rockcrete. His flames had guttered down to barely a flicker. He'd pushed himself past his limits weeks ago and kept going anyway. Now the bill was coming due. I don't know, he admitted, but I'll figure something out. The mother he'd saved earlier approached her children still clinging to her. She knelt before Natsu in a gesture that made him deeply uncomfortable. Fire Angel, she said softly. Thank you. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone cared whether I lived or died. Even if it only lasted a few weeks, that was more than most of us ever get. Don't thank me yet, I haven't saved anyone. You already did. You reminded us we're human, that we matter. No matter what happens next, you gave us that. She stood and gathered her children, leading them toward one of the passages that led deeper into the underhive. Others followed, moving with the resigned determination of people who knew they were already dead, but would make the Imperium work for it anyway. Natsu watched them go. His body screamed for rest, for medical attention, for anything except more fighting. But he couldn't stop now, wouldn't stop. Because those people were right, they did matter. Their lives had value beyond manufacturing quotas and strategic calculations. Someone needed to show the Imperium that, even if that someone was a pink-haired kid who'd only been in this universe for a few weeks, even if that someone was probably going to die trying. The flames around his fists flickered back to life. Weak, uncertain, but still burning. He had an hour before the cleaners arrived. Better start figuring out how to make it count. The cult's desperation manifested first as prayer, then as preparation, and finally as blood. Natsu could feel it building. Something worse than daemons, worse than ritual circles. The air itself felt wrong, like reality was developing a fever. He'd spent the past 30 minutes helping refugees evacuate through passages that led deeper into the Underhive, away from the sector the Space Marines had marked for cleansing. Most went quietly too beaten down to do anything except survive another day. Some refused. Where else is there to go? An old man had asked, his voice hollow with decades of hopelessness. They'll find us eventually. Better to die here than running. Natsu hadn't had an answer. He'd just kept moving. People kept clearing paths, kept doing the only thing he knew how to do. The temperature dropped suddenly. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had opened a door to the void. Natsu's breath fogged in the air. His flames flickered, responding to something his conscious mind hadn't processed yet. Then the screaming started. He ran toward the sound, his exhausted body protesting every step. The passage opened into what had been a water reclamation facility, massive tanks, rising 5 stories through the corroded infrastructure. The cultists had converted it into something else entirely. 300 of them, maybe more, filled the chamber. They'd carved symbols into every surface, patterns that hurt to look at directly. Bodies lay stacked around crude altars, fresh kills still leaking blood into channels carved to direct the flow. The channels all led to the largest tank, which had been filled with blood instead of water. The chanting made Natsu's teeth ache. Not because it was loud, but because each syllable seemed to push against the world, trying to force reality into shapes it was never meant to hold. At the center of it all stood a figure in robes so encrusted with dried blood they'd gone black. His voice carried over the others, leading the ritual, with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. "Blood for the blood god," he howled. "Skulls for the skull throne." The cultists echoed him. "Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne." The tank of blood began to boil. Steam rose from its surface, carrying the smell of copper, and something that made every instinct Natsu possessed scream warnings. The symbols on the walls started glowing, not with light, but with something that looked like light's opposite. Natsu's flames ignited, automatically responding to the threat before his brain finished processing what was happening. He'd destroyed dozens of ritual sites over the past weeks. This one was different. This one was going to succeed. "Stop!" His voice came out rougher than intended, damaged from too much fighting and not enough rest. Every cultist turned toward him. Their eyes held nothing human, just reflected glimpses of whatever horror they were trying to summon. The lead cultist's mouth split in a grin that showed teeth filed to points. "The Fire Angel," he said, and his voice held notes of triumph. "The one who burns, but does not fall. Your arrival is perfect. The blood god will feast on your flames. I'm shutting this down. You cannot. The ritual is too far advanced." The cultist gestured at the boiling blood. "Our god comes. He comes to claim what the Imperium abandoned. He comes to drown this hive in blood and fire. And you, Fire Angel, you who burned our brethren, you will be his first offering." The tank exploded. Blood erupted upward in a geyser that defied physics, climbing toward the ceiling faster than gravity should allow. Where it touched the symbols carved into the walls, they blazed with colors that had no names. The air split with a sound like reality tearing. Something stepped through the wound in the world. It was massive, easily 5 times Natsu's height, with skin the color of fresh blood and brass. Muscles that looked like they'd been carved from rage itself rippled under its hide. Wings of tattered flesh spread from its back, each membrane marked with runes that bled fire. Its face was all teeth and horns, arranged in a configuration that suggested intelligence twisted by eternity of violence. In one hand, it held an axe the size of a small building, dripping blood that burned holes through the rockcrete wherever it fell. In the other, a whip made from chains that screamed. The bloodthirster of Khorne had entered reality. The cultists prostrated themselves. "Lord of brass and blood, we offer you this world. We offer you fire and skulls and endless slaughter." The demon's eyes found Natsu. They held no mercy, no recognition of anything, except potential for violence. When it spoke, its voice shook the entire facility. "You burn with unfamiliar fire. Your skull will sit high upon my master's throne." Then it charged. Natsu barely had time to move. The demon's axe came down where he'd been standing, cutting through 5 stories of infrastructure like it was paper. Metal shrieked. Support beams shattered. The entire chamber began listing as critical structural elements ceased to exist. Natsu's flames blazed as hot as he could make them, which wasn't nearly hot enough. His fist caught the demon in its midsection, a blow that would have reduced a tank to scrap metal. The demon staggered back 1 step. Just 1. Then it smiled with too many teeth. "Strong, good. Korn will be pleased." Its whip lashed out, moving faster than Natsu could track. He tried to dodge, but exhaustion slowed his reflexes by critical fractions of seconds. The chains caught his leg wrapped around it and pulled. Natsu went flying through the air, crashing through cultists who exploded into red mist on impact. He hit a wall hard enough to leave a crater. His leg felt like it was on fire, and not in the good way. The demon was already moving toward him, each step causing the compromised floor to crack and buckle. Natsu pushed himself out of the crater. His flames flickered uncertainly, fed by reserves that had been running on empty for weeks. This thing was different from the other demons he'd fought. They'd been dangerous but manageable. This was something else entirely. This was a greater demon. A piece of a god wearing reality like an ill-fitting coat. And he had no idea how to beat it. The demon's axe came down. Natsu rolled aside, flames trailing behind him as he moved. The impact sent shockwaves through the facility. More supports gave way. Somewhere above them, people were screaming as hive structure began to collapse. Natsu tried to create distance, tried to find an opening. The demon gave him neither. It pressed forward with relentless aggression, each swing of its weapons carving new wounds through the underhive's already compromised structure. Natsu blocked when he could, dodged when he couldn't, and felt his reserves depleting with every exchange. His flames were burning dimmer. His movements were getting slower. The wounds covering his body from weeks of constant fighting hadn't healed, and now he was adding new ones to the collection. The demon, by contrast, showed no signs of fatigue or injury. Even when Natsu's flames managed to scorch its hide, the burns healed almost instantly. Mathematics were against him again. The demon's whip caught him across the chest, tearing through his jacket and the skin beneath. Natsu went down, blood painting the rockcrete. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The exhaustion he'd been pushing past for weeks finally caught up, pinning him to the ground with the weight of too many battles and not enough rest. The bloodthirster loomed over him, its shadow blocking out the flickering lumens overhead. It raised its axe, preparing to end this fight, the way it had ended countless others across millennia of warfare. Your fire dies mortal, as all fires must. Natsu's vision blurred. Blood loss or exhaustion, or both. He could feel his flames guttering out, starved of the willpower needed to keep them burning. This was it. The end of the line. He'd pushed as far as he could, saved as many as he could, and now the bill was due. Somewhere in the distance, he heard that sound again. Ceramite boots on metal. The Space Marines probably come to witness the cleanup. Or maybe just to confirm he was dead before they started the cleansing. The demon's axe began its descent. Natsu's flames erupted, not the controlled fire he'd been using, not the flames he could direct and manage. This was something else, something that came from deeper than conscious thought. His body refused to quit, refused to let the story end this way, refused to accept that he'd spent weeks protecting people just to die and leave them to the cleansing. Dragon Force. The transformation tore through him like lightning. Scales of flame covered his arms. His hair blazed white-hot. Power flooded through muscles that had been running on empty, fed by reserves he didn't know he possessed. He caught the demon's axe with his bare hands. The weapon that could cut through reality itself, stopped cold against his flame-wreathed palms. The bloodthirster's eyes widened. Just a fraction. Just enough to show that something had surprised it for the first time in millennia. Not done yet. Natsu twisted, using the demon's own momentum to send it staggering backward. Then, he was moving faster than his exhausted body should have allowed, flames trailing behind him like a comet's tail. His fist connected with the demon's jaw with force that sent shockwaves through the chamber. The demon crashed through a support pillar. The entire facility groaned as more structural elements failed. Natsu didn't care. Couldn't afford to care. Every second this fight continued, more of the hive came down around them. More people died in collateral damage. More lives were added to a tally he'd never be able to pay back. But if he could just win fast enough, maybe he could minimize the cost. The demon rose, its brass hide smoking where Natsu's flames had scorched it. For the first time, the wounds weren't healing instantly. Dragon Force was burning hot enough to damage even its supernatural flesh. "You burn brighter now," it said. "Good. A worthy skull for the throne." They collided again, and the underhive shook with the impact. Natsu's flames met the demon's brass hide in explosions that lit up the darkness like miniature suns. His fists hammered away at its defenses, each blow carrying force that would have leveled buildings. The demon gave as good as it got, its axe and whip carving wounds through Natsu's flame-covered flesh. They crashed through walls, destroyed chambers that had stood for centuries. Every impact sent tremors through the hive's foundation, threatening to bring down sections that housed millions. Natsu could hear the screaming getting louder as the fight consumed more and more of the underhive's structure. He tried to lead the demon toward empty sections, toward areas the cultists had already claimed. But the creature was intelligent enough to recognize the tactic and brutal enough to deliberately aim for inhabited areas. It wanted maximum carnage. That was its purpose, its reason for existing. Natsu's flames blazed hotter, pushing Dragon Force to its absolute limits. His scales started cracking, unable to contain the power he was forcing through them. Blood leaked from wounds that wouldn't close. But he kept fighting because stopping meant everyone died. The demon's axe caught him across the ribs, cracking bone and scorching flesh even through his flame armor. Natsu's counterpunch shattered one of the demon's horns, sending it flying through a wall and into a chamber beyond. The demon's roar of pain and fury shook the entire sector. They'd been fighting for 10 minutes. It felt like hours. The collateral damage was catastrophic. Natsu could see it in his peripheral vision as they traded blows. Hab blocks, collapsing support structures, failing entire sections of the underhive, becoming death traps as infrastructure gave way. He had to end this, now. Natsu gathered everything he had left. Every spark of power, every bit of willpower, every drop of determination that had kept him going through weeks of constant fighting. His flames compressed, condensing into something almost solid around his fist. The demon saw what he was doing and charged, axe raised to split him in half before he could release the attack. They met in the center of the chamber. Natsu's fist connected with the demon's chest. The impact created a pressure wave that shattered every remaining window in a 10-kilometer radius. The demon's brass hide cracked, then shattered, exposing the writhing essence beneath. It screamed a sound of pure rage and disbelief that a mortal could wound it so grievously. Then, it began to dissolve. The warp could no longer sustain its presence with its physical form so damaged. Piece by piece, it came apart, vanishing back to whatever hell had spawned it. "This is not over, Fire Angel," it managed to spit out as its face dissolved. "My master sees you now. Korn knows your name." Then it was gone, leaving only scorch marks and the memory of brass and blood. Natsu's Dragon Force guttered out. He dropped to his knees, then to his hands, breathing in ragged gasps that tasted of blood and ash. Every part of his body screamed protest. His flames were completely exhausted. He couldn't have lit a candle if his life depended on it. The chamber was silent, except for the groaning of compromised structure and distant screaming. The cultists who'd survived the battle fled into the Underhive's depths, their faith shattered by witnessing their god's banishment. Natsu tried to stand, failed, tried again, got his feet under him through sheer stubbornness. The floor tilted at an angle that suggested critical structural failure. Around him, he could hear the sounds of the hive beginning its collapse. Supports giving way. Levels dropping onto the levels beneath them. Millions of tons of metal and rockcrete settling as the damage from the fight propagated through the entire system. He'd won. The daemon was banished. The ritual was stopped. But the cost was going to be measured in millions of lives, buried under collapsing hive structure. Natsu stumbled toward the nearest exit, knowing it was useless. He couldn't save people from this. Couldn't stop a collapse of this magnitude. Couldn't do anything except survive and watch everything he'd been fighting for come crashing down. Literally, the ceiling above him cracked. A support beam the size of a building fell toward him, trailing smaller debris. Natsu didn't have the energy to dodge, didn't have the flames to protect himself. He just looked up at the falling death and thought about how unfair it was that he'd survived the demon only to die like this. The beam never hit him. Something caught it. Someone massive in armor that gleamed even under layers of dust and smoke. Brother Captain Routh held the support beam with one hand, his ceramite armor's servos whining under the strain. "Move," the Space Marine commanded. Natsu moved, stumbled past him toward the exit. Behind him he heard the beam crash down as Routh released it and followed. They emerged into a passage filled with refugees. The ones who'd refused to evacuate, now trying desperately to escape as their world literally fell apart around them. Space Marines were there too, the entire squad organizing the evacuation with military efficiency that seemed at odds with their earlier willingness to execute these same people. "This way!" One Marine directed, his Vox-enhanced voice cutting through the chaos. "Move quickly. The structure will not hold much longer." Natsu watched them work, confusion mixing with exhaustion. "You're helping them." Orders changed. Routh set his helmet, turning toward Natsu. "You banished a greater demon. That recategorizes you as a potential asset rather than a confirmed threat. The Inquisition will still want to examine you, but the cleansing has been postponed. Because I beat a demon. Because you demonstrated capability against entities the Imperium struggles to contain." Routh paused, watching his brothers guide refugees toward stable passages. "And because Brother Sergeant Thalric made a recommendation that I grudgingly agreed with." "What recommendation?" "That perhaps the Emperor works in ways we do not always recognize, immediately." Routh's tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with this conclusion. "You should not exist. Your flames violate known principles of psychic manifestation. Your survival against a bloodthirster of Khorne with no sanctioned training is statistically impossible. So perhaps you serve the Emperor's will whether you acknowledge him or not." Routh's helmet turned back toward the evacuation. "Or perhaps you are a heretic who simply hasn't revealed his true nature yet. Time will determine which." The passage shook as another section of hive gave way somewhere above. Dust rained from the ceiling. The Marines continued their work without pause, moving refugees with the same efficiency they'd used to clear a battlefield. "How many?" Natsu asked quietly. "How many died in the collapse?" Routh didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice held no inflection. "Preliminary estimates suggest 4 million casualties in immediate collapse zones. Another 6 million at risk in compromised sectors. Final numbers will take days to calculate. 10 million people, dead or dying. Because Natsu had fought a demon in a hive structure that couldn't handle that kind of battle. He'd won the fight and lost the war. "I didn't mean for—" "Intention is irrelevant," Routh interrupted. Outcome is what matters. The demon would have claimed far more lives had it not been stopped. You made the only tactical choice available. He started toward his brothers, then paused. The Inquisition will contact you when they're ready. Do not attempt to flee. It will only make things worse. Then he was gone, leaving Natsu alone among the refugees, streaming past. They looked at him with expressions he couldn't read, fear maybe, or gratitude, or just the numb shock of people who'd survived something they shouldn't have. The scarred woman found him there, blood-covered and barely standing. She didn't say anything, just put his arm over her shoulder and helped him walk toward whatever passed for safety in a hive that was actively collapsing. "Fire Angel," someone whispered as they passed. Others took up the word. Not chanting this time, just acknowledgement. The stranger who'd fought for them. Who'd beaten a demon but couldn't save them from the consequences. Natsu wanted to tell them he wasn't an angel. That he'd failed. The 10 million people were dead because he hadn't been strong enough to end the fight quickly enough or smart enough to find a better way. But he was too tired to form the words, too broken to argue. So he just let them believe what they wanted to believe and tried not to think about the price of victory in a universe where winning still meant millions of corpses. Behind them, the Underhive continued its slow collapse, bearing evidence of demons and rituals and hope beneath millions of tons of metal and regret. The Inquisitor arrived 3 days after the Bloodthirster was banished. Natsu spent those days in a Medicae facility that refugees had established in a sector the Space Marines designated as stable. The term was relative. Half the supporting structure had been compromised by his battle with the demon, and every few hours another tremor would shake the walls as distant sections gave way. But it was better than nothing, which was about the best anyone could hope for in the Underhive. His wounds healed slowly. Dragon Force had burned through reserves he didn't know he possessed, leaving him with damage that went deeper than torn flesh and cracked bone. The scarred woman who'd been following him for weeks checked on him regularly, bringing food and water scavenged from the ruins. She never asked for his story, never pressed for explanations about how he'd beaten a greater demon. "Doesn't matter who you were before," she'd said on the second day, "only matters what you did." What he'd done was save some people while getting millions killed through collateral damage. The math felt wrong. But Natsu was starting to understand that in this universe, wrong math was still the best anyone could manage. The Space Marines maintained a presence in the area, organizing evacuation with the same clinical efficiency they'd applied to everything else. Brother Captain Routh visited once his massive armored form, filling the Medicae facility's doorway. "The Inquisition will arrive soon," he'd said without preamble. "They will want to examine you, to determine whether you serve the Emperor's will or represent a threat to be eliminated. And if they decide I'm a threat, then you will be eliminated." Routh's tone suggested he was stating simple fact rather than making a threat. "I recommend cooperation. The Inquisition has methods of extracting information that make physical tortures seem merciful." He'd left before Natsu could respond, leaving behind only the echo of ceramite boots on metal. The Inquisitor's arrival was announced by a change in the air itself. The Underhive had its own atmosphere thick with pollution and despair. When Inquisitor Verena Kalt entered the sector, that atmosphere seemed to sharpen, becoming focused and predatory. She was smaller than Natsu expected. Average height, slender build, face that might have been beautiful before whatever life she'd lived, carved lines of suspicion into every feature. Her coat was black, cut in a style that suggested function over fashion. At her hip hung a bolt pistol with engravings that looked religious. Behind her came a retinue of soldiers in armor that gleamed despite the Underhive's grime. She found Natsu in the Medicae facility, surrounded by refugees who'd gathered because word had spread that the Fire Angel was recovering there. Her pale eyes swept across them with an expression that suggested she was calculating optimal firing solutions. "Clear this area," she commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority that made people move despite themselves. The refugees fled. Within seconds, Natsu was alone with the Inquisitor and her retinue. She studied him with the intensity of someone examining a biological specimen. "Natsu Dragneel," she said. Not a question. The anomaly, the fire angel, the being who destroyed 43 ritual sites, banished dozens of lesser demons, and somehow survived combat with a bloodthirster of Khorne. That about covers it. You should not exist. She moved closer, her hand resting on her bolt pistol but not drawing it. Your flames violate known principles of psychic manifestation. Your survival against entities that kill trained psychers suggests capabilities the Imperium cannot allow to remain unexamined. So examine away. I intend to. But first, I need you to understand your situation. She gestured to one of her retinue who activated a hololith projector. The display showed Calastian 9 from orbit, the hive world's ugly mass spinning against the void. This is your current location. Population 42 billion before recent events. 36 billion now following the structural collapse you caused. The number hit like a punch. 6 billion. Not 6 million. 6 billion people dead because he'd fought a demon in infrastructure that couldn't handle that kind of battle. I didn't mean intention is irrelevant. Cult's expression didn't change. Outcome is what matters. You banished a greater demon, which is noteworthy. You also destabilized a hive world, which is catastrophic. The Imperium must now determine whether your existence represents a net positive or net negative for humanity's survival. She deactivated the hololith. The image of Calastian 9 lingered in Natsu's vision anyway. That ugly sphere that held more people than his entire world had contained. The preliminary assessment has been completed. Cult continued. You are not chaos-tainted, which surprised several of my colleagues. You appear to operate with genuine desire to protect human life, which complicates the theological implications. But you are also powerful, uncontrolled, and now associated with spontaneous worship among the lower classes. I told them I wasn't an angel. What you told them is irrelevant. They believe it anyway. Do you understand how dangerous that is? For the first time, emotion crept into her voice. Not anger, but something that might have been exhaustion. Faith is the foundation of the Imperium. Faith in the Emperor, absolute and unquestioning. When that faith gets redirected toward individuals, systems begin to collapse, wars are fought, billions die. So, what do you want me to do? Nothing. You will do nothing because the decision has already been made. She pulled a data slate from her coat and activated it. The document displayed bore seals Natsu didn't recognize, but the effect they had on Cult's retinue suggested they carried significant weight. Calastian 9 has been declared perdita. She read from the slate without inflection. The recent structural instability combined with persistent chaos, cult activity, and the emergence of unsanctioned worship has rendered the planet strategically untenable. Exterminatus protocols have been authorized. The word meant nothing to Natsu. What's exterminatus? Complete sterilization. The Imperial Navy is currently positioning a fleet in high orbit. Within 36 hours, they will deploy life-eater virus bombs across the planet's surface. Every living thing will die. The planet will become a tomb world, unsuitable for habitation for the next century. Natsu stared at her. You're going to kill 36 billion people. No, the Imperium is going to kill 36 billion people. I am simply the instrument delivering the message. She deactivated the data slate. Evacuation is not feasible on this scale. The fleet does not have capacity for billions. We might save a few million priority cases like skilled workers and administratum personnel. The rest will die with the planet. That's insane. That's necessity. Cult's pale eyes held no apology. This world was already declining. Manufacturing efficiency had dropped below acceptable thresholds. Chaos corruption was spreading despite containment efforts. Your arrival and subsequent actions simply accelerated a process that was already inevitable. So this is my fault. Partially. But the planet was already doomed. You simply made the timeline more immediate. She turned toward the exit, then paused. There is a ship leaving in 6 hours. It has space for approximately 2,000 passengers. I'm offering you a choice. Come with us. Allow yourself to be examined and catalogued by the Inquisition, or remain here and die with the world you tried to save. What about them? Natsu gestured toward where the refugees had fled. The people I've been protecting. They die. Most of them. We might save a few if they possess useful skills, but the underhive population is largely expendable. Her tone suggested she was discussing inventory rather than lives. The Imperium has billions more where they came from. She left. Her retinue followed their boots, echoing through the Medici facility. Natsu sat alone in the silence, surrounded by empty beds and the ghost of a conversation that had just sentenced a world to death. The tremor that shook the facility might have been another structural collapse. Or maybe it was just his hands shaking with rage he had no outlet for. The refugees returned cautiously after the Inquisitor departed. They looked at Natsu with expressions that mixed hope and fear, still believing he was their fire angel, still thinking he could save them. He couldn't even look at them. The scarred woman sat down beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just sat with the same exhausted patience she'd shown for weeks. They're killing the planet, Natsu finally said. In 36 hours, everyone dies. Exterminatus. She nodded like this was expected. We always knew it was possible. The Imperium doesn't tolerate worlds it can't control. You knew this might happen, and you stayed. Where else would we go? She smiled bitter and hollow. At least here we had a few weeks where someone gave a damn whether we lived or died. That's more than most people in the Underhive ever get. Natsu's fists clenched. His flames flickered weakly, still depleted from the battle with the bloodthirster. There has to be something we can do. Like what, fight the Imperial Navy? She gestured at the makeshift Medici facility, the wounded refugees, the compromised structure around them. Look at us. We're barely surviving as it is. How are we supposed to fight an entire fleet? She was right. Natsu knew she was right. But accepting it felt like betrayal of everything he'd fought for over the past weeks. The Inquisitor offered me a way out, he said quietly. A ship. Space for 2,000 people. Take it. The woman's response was immediate. Get yourself and as many others as you can off this rock. Survival is victory when Exterminatus comes. 2,000 people, out of 36 billion. 2,000 more than would survive if you stayed here and died uselessly. She stood wincing as old injuries protested. You've done more for us than anyone else ever did. Don't throw that away by dying when you don't have to. She walked away before Natsu could argue. Left him alone with the weight of a choice that felt like no choice at all. The next 30 hours passed in a blur of activity Natsu barely participated in. Word spread through the Underhive about the Exterminatus. Some people rioted, some prayed. Most just went about their lives with the numb acceptance of people who'd never expected to live long anyway. The Inquisitor's retinue identified individuals for evacuation. Skilled workers, engineers. A few children who showed aptitude for tasks the Imperium valued. They moved through the Underhive with efficiency that felt obscene, sorting human lives into categories of useful and expendable. Natsu found himself in the useful category by default. The Inquisition wanted to study him. That alone earned him a spot on the evacuation ship. He tried to help where he could. Carried wounded to the evacuation points. Used his diminished flames to clear rubble blocking paths. But it felt like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. For every person who got evacuated, thousands more were left behind. The scarred woman made it onto one of the transports. She'd shown competence at organizing refugees, which apparently qualified as a useful skill. She waved at Natsu as the transport lifted off, heading toward orbit and whatever safety the evacuation fleet offered. She didn't smile, just raised her hand in acknowledgement of everything they'd been through together, then was gone. Brother Captain Routh found Natsu at one of the final evacuation points. The Space Marine stood like a monument among the chaos, his damaged armor repaired, but still bearing scars from the battle with cultists. "The fleet will begin bombardment in 4 hours," he said without preamble. "Your presence is required on the inquisitorial vessel. Orders from Inquisitor Cult. What about everyone else? Everyone else dies." "This is understood." Routh's tone carried no judgment, just statement of fact. "The Emperor requires sacrifice. Today, Kalashtian 9 makes that sacrifice. And you're okay with that? My feelings are irrelevant. The Imperium's survival requires harsh measures. Individual lives matter less than humanity's continuation." He turned toward the landing pad where a shuttle waited. "Come. There's no more to be done here." Natsu looked back at the underhive. At the people still trying to find shelter, still hoping for salvation that wasn't coming. At the sectors he'd fought to protect, now condemned to die anyway. "I could stay," he said. "Try to save more people. You would die uselessly. The Imperium would still deploy the virus bombs. Nothing would change, except one less anomaly for the Inquisition to examine." Routh's helmet turned toward him. "Choose survival. Learn from this. Perhaps next time you will make better decisions." Next time. As if there would be a next time. As if he'd ever want to do this again. But Routh was right. Dying here wouldn't save anyone. Wouldn't change the Imperium's decision. Wouldn't make the mathematics of 36 billion deaths any less horrifying. So Natsu followed the Space Marine to the shuttle. Climbed aboard with the last group of evacuees. Strapped into a seat designed for normal humans that barely accommodated his exhausted frame, the shuttle lifted off. Through the viewport, Natsu watched Kalashtian 9 shrink below them. The hive world's ugly surface was scarred by his battle with the demon great rifts visible even from altitude. The sectors he'd protected looked so small from up here, insignificant against the scale of the world. The shuttle docked with an Imperial cruiser massive beyond any structure Natsu had encountered. He was escorted through corridors that seemed designed to make humans feel small. Eventually, they reached an observation deck overlooking the planet. Inquisitor Cult stood, their hands clasped behind her back, staring at Kalashtian 9 with an expression Natsu couldn't read. 4 hours, she said without looking at him. Then the virus bombs deploy. Life Eaters strain. It will consume every organic molecule on the planet within 6 hours of dispersal. 36 billion people will die screaming. You don't have to do this. Yes, we do. The Imperium cannot afford weakness. Cannot afford to let compromised worlds remain as potential vectors for chaos corruption. She finally turned toward him. You tried to save them. I acknowledge that. But salvation is not within your power to grant. Then whose power is it? The Emperor's? And he has judged this world wanting. Her pale eyes held something that might have been pity. Learn this lesson, Fire Angel. In the Imperium, good intentions mean nothing against strategic necessity. You can save individuals. You cannot save systems. The fleet began its bombardment on schedule. Natsu watched through the viewport as torpedoes fell toward Kalashtian 9, trailing fire as they entered atmosphere. They looked so small from this distance, so harmless. Each one carried enough virus to kill billions. The Life Eater spread fast. Natsu couldn't see it from orbit, but he could imagine it, creeping through the underhive's passages, touching refugees who'd survived everything else, ending lives in ways too terrible to contemplate. 36 billion people, gone, because the Imperium decided they were expendable. Because Natsu hadn't been strong enough to stop the demon without destroying half the hive's infrastructure. Because this was how the universe worked, and no amount of fire or determination could change that. "I failed them," he said quietly. "Yes." Kalt's answer was immediate and without mercy. "You failed them because you approached an Imperium problem with outsider thinking. You believed individuals mattered. You believed protection meant keeping everyone alive. You learned otherwise." "Is this supposed to make me feel better?" "No. It's supposed to teach you how this universe functions." She turned from the viewport. "The shuttle will take you to processing. The Inquisition will examine you, determine your nature, and decide whether you serve the Emperor's interests. If you do, you may survive. If not..." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The threat was clear enough. As Natsu was escorted from the observation deck, he looked back one more time at Calastron 9. The planet looked peaceful from here. Beautiful even in the way dying things sometimes were. By tomorrow it would be a tomb. A monument to the price of failure in a universe that measured success in corpses. And Natsu the Fire Angel, who'd tried to save them all, had a front row seat to watch his rescue turn into genocide. The flames around his fists had died completely. He wondered if they'd ever burn the same way again. The inquisitorial processing facility existed in a state between imprisonment and observation. Natsu wasn't confined to a cell so much as confined to existence under constant surveillance. Sensors tracked his every movement. Servo skulls drifted through his quarters at irregular intervals, their augury arrays recording data for analysis. Even sleep offered no privacy. He'd been here for 6 weeks, long enough to watch Calastron 9 die through observation ports that looked out toward the dead world. The planet still hung in space, a gray corpse slowly cooling, as the Life-Eater virus consumed every trace of organic matter. 36 billion people reduced to chemical slurry. Inquisitor Kalt visited regularly. Not interrogations exactly, more like assessments. She'd ask questions about his flames, about how he'd banished the bloodthirster, about what he remembered from before arriving in this universe. Natsu answered when he felt like it, which wasn't often. "You're remarkably uncooperative for someone whose survival depends on inquisitorial approval," she'd observed during one session. "You're going to kill me or you're not," Natsu had replied. "Answering questions won't change that." She hadn't disagreed. The scarred woman visited once. They'd allowed it as part of determining Natsu's psychological profile. She looked different in clean clothes, her burns treated by proper medics instead of scavenged supplies. The improvement made the scars more obvious somehow. "They're putting me to work in manufacturing oversight," she'd said without preamble. Turns out organizing refugees translates well to organizing workers. Better food than the underhive, at least. "That's good." "Is it?" She'd looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "I survived. 2,000 of us survived. Everyone else is dead. I'm not sure good is the word I'd use." Natsu hadn't had an answer for that. She'd left after 10 minutes, and he hadn't seen her since. The examination itself was conducted by a team of specialists whose credentials Natsu didn't understand, but whose intensity he couldn't miss. Tech priests analyzed his flames, measuring energy signatures and comparing them against databases of known psychic phenomena. Psychers probed at his mind, looking for taint of chaos or evidence of warp corruption. Biologist teams took samples trying to determine what made his body capable of channeling fire that didn't burn him. None of them found anything useful. Or rather, they found that he didn't fit any existing categories. Not psyker, not mutant, not demon-touched. Just an anomaly that violated established principles without offering explanations. Unprecedented. One tech priest had declared his mechadendrites twitching with agitation. The energy matrices suggest immaterial sourcing, but without warp signature, it shouldn't be possible. And yet, Kalt had replied dryly, the political debate about what to do with him lasted longer than the examination. Natsu only heard fragments overheard through conversations between his guards, or glimpsed in reports cult left carelessly visible. Some faction wanted him weaponized, turned into an asset the Inquisition could deploy against high-value chaos threats. Others wanted him terminated immediately, arguing that anything they didn't understand represented unacceptable risk. A third group wanted him studied indefinitely, kept in containment while they tried to replicate whatever made his flames work. Democracy, Cult had explained during one visit, is not an imperial virtue, but competing interests within the Inquisition sometimes resemble it. Unfortunately for you, consensus is proving difficult to achieve. So I just wait here while you argue about whether to kill me, essentially. Though argue implies a level of civility that doesn't reflect reality. 3 inquisitors have already declared each other heretics over your case. One has been disappeared, presumably by another's operatives. She'd said it with the same tone someone might use to discuss weather patterns. The decision, when it finally came, surprised everyone, including Cult. They're releasing you. She'd announced her expression, suggesting she didn't approve. Releasing me where Kalash 9 is dead, to a border world in the Segmentum Obscurus. Remote location, minimal infrastructure, recent chaos incursion that requires cleanup. You'll work under inquisitorial supervision, using your capabilities to destroy cult activity and banish demons. Success will be evaluated quarterly. Failure or deviation from assigned parameters will result in immediate termination. Natsu had stared at her. So I'm a weapon now. You're a resource being utilized. Consider yourself fortunate. The alternative was a bolt round through your skull. She'd pulled out a data slate and passed it to him. These are your operational parameters. Read them. Memorize them. Violating them, even once, will be interpreted as hostile action. The slate detailed a list of restrictions that read like a prison sentence disguised as employment. He could only use his flames against designated targets. He couldn't gather followers or allow civilians to associate his actions with anything except the Emperor's will. He couldn't make decisions without approval from his assigned inquisitorial handler. He was in essence a tool to be used and discarded when convenient. And if I refuse, then you're no longer a resource. You're a threat. Cult's pale eyes held no warmth. The galaxy has enough threats. We don't need to preserve another one out of sentiment. So Natsu had agreed because the alternative was death, and he'd already failed enough people without adding himself to the tally. The transport to his new assignment departed 3 days later. It was a bulk hauler converted for passenger use, filled with refugees from various disaster zones being relocated to worlds that needed workers. Natsu sat among them anonymous, in clothing that didn't mark him as anything except another displaced person. Nobody recognized him. Nobody knew he was the fire angel who'd tried to save Calastian 9. That identity had died with the planet. Through the viewport, he watched the stars slide past. Somewhere out there was home, the world he'd been torn from. Friends who probably thought he was dead. A life that felt increasingly distant, like something he'd read about rather than lived. Dragon Force was gone. He could still feel the potential for it buried deep in reserves that had been scorched to nothing by the battle with the Bloodthirster. But actually accessing it would require time and recovery he wasn't getting. For now, he was running on fumes and stubbornness, same as always. The border world was exactly as advertised, remote, underdeveloped, and infested with chaos cultists who'd taken advantage of recent disruption to establish ritual sites in the wilderness. Natsu's handler was an inquisitorial acolyte who looked barely older than him, but carried herself with the weary cynicism of someone who'd seen too much. Your first target is a cult compound approximately 40 kilometers north, she'd briefed him. Intelligence suggests between 30 and 50 cultists, plus various lesser demons they've summoned. Standard clearance protocol: destroy the ritual sites, banish any demons, eliminate the cultists. No survivors. No survivors, Natsu repeated. They're chaos tainted. Saving them isn't an option. Her tone suggested this was obvious. Orbital bombardment would be more efficient, but the Inquisition wants to evaluate your performance in controlled scenarios before escalating your assignments. So Natsu went north, carrying flames that felt weaker than they should, and a certainty that this was his life now. Find cultists, burn them, move to the next target. Repeat until he died, or the Inquisition decided he wasn't useful anymore. The compound was built around a natural cave system that the cultists had converted into ritual chambers. Familiar symbols covered the walls, patterns that hurt to look at directly. Natsu burned them anyway, methodically destroying every altar and icon he found. The cultists tried to fight. He killed them because he'd been ordered to, and because part of him was too tired to care anymore. A lesser demon manifested near the compound's center. Not a bloodthirster, thank whatever passed for gods in this universe. Just a minor entity that screamed threats about its master's vengeance. Natsu's flames reduced it to ash and bad memories. The operation took 6 hours. When he returned, his handler marked the assignment complete without comment or praise. Just moved on to briefing him about the next target, another compound. More cultists, same pattern. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks into months. Natsu burned cultists and demons, destroyed ritual sites, moved from target to target with mechanical efficiency. His flames grew steadier as his reserves slowly recovered. Not back to full strength, probably never back to Dragon Force, but enough to do what the Inquisition required. He didn't gather followers, didn't attract attention, didn't do anything except his assigned missions. The border world's population barely knew he existed, which was exactly how the Inquisition wanted it. At night, when surveillance relaxed slightly, Natsu would sit in whatever quarters he'd been assigned and think about Calastian 9, about the refugees who'd called him Fire Angel, about the scarred woman who'd survived because he'd fought hard enough to buy her evacuation time, about 36 billion people who died because structural collapse was apparently acceptable collateral damage. The Imperium called it necessity, called it the price of survival in a hostile universe, called it anything except what it actually was, a system. So broken that mass murder became routine policy. But Natsu kept burning cultists anyway, because what else was he going to do? Die uselessly, run away, and leave people to chaos corruption. He'd tried fighting the system and learned that individuals couldn't beat institutions spanning 40,000 years. So he'd become a weapon instead. Let the Inquisition point him at targets and pull the trigger. It was better than nothing, better than being dead. The years passed like that. Natsu moved from border world to border world, always in remote locations, where his presence wouldn't attract notice. The Inquisition rotated his handlers regularly, never letting him form attachments or learn too much about their operations. He was a tool, not a person. Tools didn't need friends or context. Sometimes he wondered if this was punishment or mercy. The Inquisition kept him alive and gave him targets that legitimately needed killing, but they'd also stripped away everything except the fighting, reducing him to exactly what he'd tried not to become, someone who solved problems with violence and moved on. 5 years after Calastian 9, his current handler brought orders for a new assignment. Another chaos incursion, another ritual site, another batch of cultists to burn. Standard work. Except the location was different. Not a border world, but a hive world in the Segmentum Solar. Major population center, strategic importance. Recent reports of cult activity in the Underhive. Inquisitor cult specifically requested you for this operation, the handler explained. She said you had experience with hive world environments. Natsu's flames flickered at the mention of cult's name. What's the world called? Calastian 9 has been declared suitable for recolonization. The Life Eater virus has degraded sufficiently that settlement can begin within the decade. However, preliminary surveys detected anomalous energy signatures in the underhive sectors. Your assignment is to investigate and eliminate any chaos presence before colonization proceeds. Natsu stared at her. Calastian 9, the world you killed. The world the Imperium sterilized, yes. You were present during the exterminatus, so you're familiar with the geography. She said it without inflection, like discussing traffic patterns. The Inquisition wants verification that no corruption survived the virus. You'll deploy a lone conduct reconnaissance, eliminate any threats, and report findings. They want me to go back. They want you to complete your assignment. Emotional attachment to previous operations is irrelevant, so Natsu went back to the world he'd failed to save. The transport descended through atmosphere that still tasted of poison and death. The hive structures stood empty monuments to extinction. Nothing moved in the passages except wind through broken windows. The underhive was a tomb, corridors filled with the crystallized remains of what used to be people. Natsu walked through sectors he'd fought to protect, past areas where refugees had gathered, through passages where he'd battled cultists and demons. Everything was preserved in grotesque detail by the virus organic matter converted to mineral deposits that held the shape of life without containing any. The scarred woman's remains were in Manufactorum Level 7. Natsu recognized her by the burn pattern still visible on her crystallized face. She had died at her station, probably never knowing the virus was coming until it touched her. 2,000 survivors, the Inquisition had said. He'd found evidence of at least 30 deaths just in this sector alone. Either their count was wrong, or people had been lost in transit. Numbers on reports were always cleaner than reality. The anomalous energy signature was in the same sector where he'd fought the Bloodthirster. 5 years of viral degradation and atmospheric exposure, but something still registered on Imperial sensors. Natsu approached cautiously flames, ready expecting another demon, or maybe residual warp corruption. Instead, he found a mark, burned into the rockcrite where he'd stood during the final exchange with the Bloodthirster. A handprint charred deep into stone that should have been sterilized by the Life Eater. His handprint wreathed in flames that had somehow survived atmospheric re-entry viral bombardment and 5 years of decay. The flames were still burning. Not bright, not hot enough to feel from more than a meter away, but burning nonetheless, a flicker of orange and red that refused to die. Natsu knelt beside the mark, reached out to touch flames that looked like his own. They didn't burn him, just flickered against his palm, warm and steady and impossibly persistent. The fire that refused to end, a voice said behind him. Natsu turned. Inquisitor Cult stood in the passage, her black coat absorbing what little light filtered down from the broken ceiling. She looked older than he remembered, new lines carved into her face by years of making decisions that killed billions. I knew you'd find it eventually. She continued, moving closer to study the burning handprint. We detected the signature 3 years ago. Persistent thermal anomaly, no identifiable fuel source, no warp corruption. The Mechanicus has been arguing about it ever since. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to see your reaction when you discovered it yourself. She crouched beside the mark, close enough that the flames should have burned her. They didn't. Do you understand what this means? That my fire doesn't follow your rules? That nothing about you follows our rules? Cult's pale eyes reflected orange light. You shouldn't exist. Your flames shouldn't persist. You definitely shouldn't have survived Dragon Force activation against a greater demon. Yet here you are, and there's your fire burning 5 years after it should have died. Natsu touched the flames again. They pulsed against his palm, almost like recognition. What do you want, Cult? To tell you that I was wrong? She stood brushing dust from her coat. 5 years ago, I told you that you couldn't save systems, that individuals didn't matter against institutional necessity. I believed that then, and now I've spent 5 years watching the Imperium use you as a weapon. You've cleared 47 cult sites, banished 19 demons, killed approximately 4,000 cultists. She recited the numbers without checking any records. You've done everything we asked without complaint, without deviation from parameters. You've been the perfect tool. That was the deal. Yes. And in that time, something interesting happened. The border worlds where you operated showed decreased chaos activity overall. Not just in areas you cleared, but neighboring sectors. As if your presence somehow discouraged cult formation. She gestured at the burning handprint. The Mechanicus has a theory. They think your flames aren't just fire. They think they're a form of existence that chaos finds inherently hostile. Natsu looked at the mark. I'm not following. Chaos feeds on emotion, on belief, on the collective psychic weight of human suffering. Your flames burn with something different, something that exists independent of warp influence. Cult's expression was unreadable. You're not Psyker. You're not drawing power from the Imperium. You're drawing from somewhere else entirely, somewhere chaos can't touch. So what I'm still just one person, still can't change the fact that the Imperium killed 36 billion people. No. But you changed the fact that 2,000 survived when the Imperium's calculations suggested zero viable evacuation. She turned toward the exit. Your transport leaves in 6 hours. Your next assignment is in the Segmentum Pacificus. More cult activity, more targets. Standard work. She paused at the passage threshold. The handprint will keep burning. We'll monitor it, study it, try to understand what makes it possible. Maybe we'll learn something. Maybe we won't. But it will keep burning long after you and I are dust. Then she was gone, leaving Natsu alone with flames that refused to die. He stayed there for hours, watching orange light flicker in the darkness of a dead world. 36 billion people had died here. The Fire Angel had failed to save them. But 2,000 had lived, and somewhere in Imperial space, the scarred woman's memory probably continued organizing workers with the same efficiency she'd shown organizing refugees. That was something. Not enough, never enough. But something. The transport off-world was scheduled. The next assignment was waiting. The Inquisition expected him to continue being their weapon-burning cultists and demons while they decided whether he was asset or threat. Natsu took one last look at the burning handprint, his flames persistent beyond reason or logic. Proof that he'd been here, that he'd fought, that he'd tried. The fire that refused to end. He left Kalasha 9 behind for the second time. But the flames stayed burning in the empty dark, waiting for whatever came next. Decades later, an inquisitorial survey team would find the mark still burning. They'd file reports, requisition studies, argue about implications. Some would see it as blessing, others as curse. The debate would continue long after the original incident was forgotten. But the flames would keep burning, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war and death, and the weight of 40,000 years crushing human souls to dust somewhere in the dead underhive of a recolonized world, a handprint burned with fire that answered to no gods. And in the spaces between stars, wherever the Inquisition pointed him, Natsu Dragneel continued doing what he'd always done, burning cultists, banishing demons, protecting people when the Imperium allowed it, killing when they commanded it. Not a hero, not an angel, just a weapon that refused to break, just fire that refused to end.